Its red and white pole still spun outside the door, though the motor had been replaced twice. The black and white tile floor had seen thousands of shoes, thousands of Saturdays, thousands of conversations between men who came in strangers and left feeling somehow lighter. The smell of talcum powder and warm shaving cream had soaked so deeply into the walls that no amount of renovation would ever wash it out. Martin Elroy, 67 years old, came here every third Saturday without fail. Not because he had much hair left to cut. The silver that remained at his temples was thin enough that a trim took all of 7 minutes. He came because Eddie, the barber, had been cutting his hair for 22 years, and because sitting in that old leather chair, watching the neighborhood move past the window, felt like one of the last truly unchanged things in his life. Martin was a retired civil engineer, 40 years of bridges, overpasses, and drainage systems. He had designed structures that would outlast him by centuries, yet somehow the smaller structures of his personal life had proven far more fragile. His marriage to Diane had ended 11 years ago, not with drama or betrayal, but with the slow, quiet erosion that happens when two people grow into entirely different shapes and neither one notices until they're sitting across the dinner table one evening, looking at a stranger wearing the face of someone they once loved. They had parted without bitterness. Their daughter Renee split her holidays between them with practiced diplomacy. Martin lived alone in a two-bedroom house with a garden he maintained with the same methodical care he had once given to structural blueprints. He did not think of himself as lonely. He thought of himself as settled. There is a difference, he would tell Eddie, between being alone and being lonely. Lonely is wanting something you don't have. Settled is having made peace with what is. Eddie, who had been married to the same woman for 38 years and still brought her coffee in bed every morning, would nod in the way that means, "I hear you, but I don't quite believe you." On the third Saturday of October, Martin walked into the barber shop at his usual time, 10 in the morning, and found something different. The waiting area, which normally held 2 or 3 men flipping through old magazines, had a new face in it. A woman sat in the corner chair, reading a paperback novel with the focused attention of someone who reads not to pass time, but because she genuinely loves it. She was perhaps 63 or 64. Martin was never precise about ages, an irony given his profession, with warm brown skin, silver-laced natural hair, and the kind of composed, unhurried presence that some people carry like a second skin. Martin said hello to Eddie, took his usual seat, and opened the sports section of the newspaper that lived permanently on the side table. He did not think about the woman in the corner. This was not because she wasn't worth thinking about. It was because Martin Elroy, by long habit, had stopped noticing when a woman paid him any particular attention. At 67, he had quietly, almost unconsciously, removed himself from that particular story. He was an audience member now, not a participant. What he did not know, what he was entirely unaware of, sitting there with his sports section and his comfortable assumptions about his own invisibility, was that the woman in the corner had looked up from her novel 3 times since he walked in. Not a glance, a look. The kind that is slightly longer than the situation requires. The kind that comes back. Her name was Gloria Tate. She was 64, recently retired from a career as a high school principal, 30 years of managing students, staff, parents, and school boards with calm, absolute authority. She had been divorced for 6 years from a man who, she told her sister, had been a good person but a poor match. She had 2 grandchildren in Atlanta, a book club she attended every other Tuesday, and a habit of being exactly honest with herself about what she wanted. What she currently wanted, sitting in Eddie's barber shop, waiting for her nephew's appointment to finish, was for the silver-haired man across the room to look up from his newspaper. He did not look up from his newspaper. Gloria turned a page she hadn't actually read. When Eddie called Martin to the chair, Martin folded his paper, stood, and gave the waiting area a general, polite smile, the kind that includes everyone and no one. Gloria received it exactly as it was given. She smiled back with something slightly warmer than general politeness, but Martin was already moving toward a chair and did not see it. He settled in, met his own eyes in the mirror, and watched Eddie begin the familiar ritual of the cape and the comb. New customer? Martin asked, tilting his head slightly toward the waiting area. Gloria? No, she's been coming in for years. Her nephew Damon is one of mine. You just never overlap. Eddie worked the comb through Martin's silver temple. She's good people. Principal for 30 years over at Jefferson High. Just retired. Martin nodded in the way that means interesting, without meaning I'm going to do anything with that information. In the mirror, at the very edge of his vision, he could see Gloria. She had returned to her book, but as Eddie began to talk about the upcoming game, he always talked about the upcoming game, Martin noticed something he couldn't immediately name. Something about the angle of Gloria's book. She was holding it at a slight tilt, her eyes directed at the page, but the angle of her head was oriented, ever so slightly, toward his reflection in the mirror. She wasn't reading. She was listening. Martin looked back at his own face in the mirror and said nothing. But something, some small and long dormant thing, shifted very slightly in his chest. His trim finished in 8 minutes. He paid Eddie, tipped as always, and turned toward the door. Gloria was still in her chair, book in hand. As Martin passed, she looked up. Their eyes met for a moment. A real moment, not a social accident. Good morning, she said. Her voice was warm and direct. Good morning, Martin said. He paused, and the pause was a fraction longer than a man simply being polite would pause. Good book? She tilted the cover toward him. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. One of the best I've ever read, she said. Have you? I haven't, Martin said, but my daughter keeps telling me I should. Your daughter has good taste. The corner of her mouth curved in a way that was warm and direct and entirely unambiguous. Martin smiled, a real smile, surprised out of him. He said goodbye, walked out the door, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the October morning air. He thought about the angle of her book, the 3 times she had looked up, which he hadn't consciously registered but which had somehow lodged itself in him anyway, the way you sometimes know a song without remembering learning it. The way she had said, "Your daughter has good taste," which was an answer that had nothing to do with books. Martin Elroy, 67 years old, retired civil engineer, stood on Clover Avenue in the 3rd Saturday of October and thought, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Then he thought, but I remember what these signs mean. He called his daughter that afternoon. Renee was 41, a family therapist in Charlotte, and she had the particular advantage of being both Martin's child and a professional student of human behavior. She also had his directness, without his tendency toward emotional self-sufficiency, which made her both easier and harder to talk to. I met someone today, Martin said, or I don't know if met is the right word. I was in the barber shop. Renee was quiet for exactly 1 second, the silence of someone recalibrating their afternoon plans. Tell me everything, he told her. The book, the angle of the head, the 3 looks he couldn't quite prove he'd seen. The pause. Your daughter has good taste. When he finished, Renee was quiet for a moment in a different way, the way of someone choosing their words carefully, which was unusual for her. Dad, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When do I not? When did you last let yourself believe that a woman might be interested in you? The question sat in the air between them. Martin started to say, that's not, and then stopped. He was an engineer. He dealt in precision. Imprecise answers were a form of dishonesty. A long time, he said finally. I know, Rennie said gently, and I think that's why you almost walked out of that barber shop without saying a word to her. You're not oblivious, Dad. You've just been telling yourself a story about being invisible for so long that you've started to believe it. Martin sat with that for a moment. Outside his window, the garden was doing its October things, the roses finishing, the maple he'd planted the year Rennie was born turning amber at the edges. She showed you three things, Rennie continued, and I want you to understand what they mean, not as tricks, not as games, but as the way people communicate when the stakes feel too high to use words. Martin leaned back in his chair. For the second time that day, he felt like a student. The first sign, Rennie said, is repeated eye contact that comes back. A single glance means nothing. We all look around a room. But when someone looks at you, looks away, and then looks back again, that's not accidental. The body doesn't return to something it isn't drawn to. She looked at you 3 times before you even sat in the chair, Dad. That's not coincidence. That's interest looking for permission. Martin thought about the waiting room. 3 times. He had noted it without filing it. The way you register a sound you don't yet have a category for. The second sign, Renee said, is body orientation. People physically turn toward what holds their attention. It's entirely unconscious. The body points itself at what the mind wants without asking permission. You noticed she was holding her book at an angle toward your reflection. You noticed it clearly enough to mention it to me. That wasn't accidental on her part, even though she probably didn't realize she was doing it. She was facing you the way a sunflower faces the sun, not because it decided to, but because something deeper than decision was in charge. Martin set down his coffee cup. And the third sign, Renee said, and her voice was slightly softer now, is the response that goes one step further than the question asked. You asked about the book. She could have said yes, it's good. She could have nodded and gone back to reading. Instead, she said, what was it? Your daughter has good taste, Martin said quietly. She brought your family into a 30-second conversation about a book she didn't know you'd read. That's not small talk, Dad. That's someone reaching. Someone making the conversation slightly more personal than it needs to be, on purpose, even if she doesn't fully know she's doing it, because she wants you to know that she sees you as a person, not just a polite stranger in a waiting room. The garden outside had gone quiet in the way of late afternoon. Martin could hear the maple leaves shifting in a wind he couldn't yet feel through the glass. I'm 67, he said. Not as an objection, more as a fact he was examining. She's probably 60-something too, Renee said, and she walked into a barber shop and looked at a silver-haired man reading a sports section and decided he was worth looking at twice, and 3 times. Give her the credit of knowing what she was doing. Martin was quiet for a long moment. Eddie would know if she comes back next week, he said finally. Renee laughed. A full, warm laugh that sounded like her mother when she laughed, which was something Martin still noticed after 11 years. Yes, she said, Eddie would know. He called Eddie that evening, not to ask about Gloria specifically, that felt presumptuous, the kind of thing that required more certainty than he had, but to ask a question he disguised as casual conversation. Does Damon come in regularly? Every 3 weeks, like clockwork, Eddie said. Gloria usually brings him when her sister's working. Why? Just curious, Martin said. She seemed like a nice person. There was a pause on Eddie's end, the pause of a man who has cut hair for 35 years and understands that most of what people say in barber shops is the surface of something else. She is a nice person, Eddie said. One of the best. Another pause. Damon's next appointment is the 2nd Saturday of November. Martin said thank you and good night. He sat in his garden until the cold came up from the ground and told him it was time to go inside. He thought about bridges, how you never build a bridge by starting in the middle. You find the near bank first. You understand the ground you're standing on, and then, carefully, with full awareness of what could fail and full commitment to building something that won't, you begin to extend toward the other side. He was not a man who acted without preparation, but he was, he realized, for the first time in a long time, a man who wanted to act. Martin arrived at Eddie's barbershop at 9:45 on the second Saturday of November. This was 15 minutes earlier than his usual time. He told himself this was because he wanted to beat traffic, which was not true. Clover Avenue had not had meaningful traffic on a Saturday morning in 30 years. He was wearing his better flannel, the charcoal grey one that Renee had given him 2 Christmases ago and said made him look distinguished. He had brought a book, not the sports section, a history of the Brooklyn Bridge, which he had been meaning to read for 2 years and which he felt, in some private way, was the right book to be holding today. He sat in the waiting area and opened it. He had read approximately 1 paragraph when the door opened. Gloria came in first, followed by a teenage boy with headphones around his neck who was clearly Damon. She was wearing a deep burgundy coat over dark jeans, and she was laughing at something her nephew had just said. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that shows you exactly who someone is. She looked up. Their eyes met immediately. Her laugh didn't stop. It just shifted, softened into something warmer and more deliberate, and she said, "You again." "Me again," Martin said, and stood, not because standing was necessary, but because it was the right thing to do, and Martin Elroy had always understood that the right thing to do and the necessary thing were often different measurements. "Good book?" she asked, nodding at the Brooklyn Bridge history in his hand. "I only just started," he said. "My verdict is pending." She smiled, not the polite corner-of-the-mouth smile from 3 weeks ago, a full smile, open, direct, unguarded, in exactly the way her laugh had been. She sat in the waiting chair across from him rather than the corner where she'd been before, and the distance between them was noticeably, deliberately smaller. Martin sat back down. He opened his book. She opened hers. For 11 minutes, they read in companionable parallel. 2 people occupying the same quiet space with a comfort that had no business existing between strangers who had spoken a total of 4 sentences. Then Gloria said, without looking up from her page, "Isabel Wilkerson also wrote Caste, if you're looking for your next book." Martin looked up. "Is it as good?" "Different," she said, "but yes, in a different way." She met his eyes. "I could lend you my copy. I've already read it twice." The waiting room was quiet. Somewhere behind the partition, Eddie's scissors made their steady, familiar sound. Martin held her gaze for a moment. Not a glance, not a social accident, but a real look, the kind he had been on the receiving end of 3 weeks ago without fully knowing it. He understood now what Gloria had been doing in that waiting room in October, and he understood that what she was doing now was something one step further, an open door offered without apology, waiting to see whether he would walk through it. He was a man who built bridges. He knew what an open door looked like. "I'd like that," he said. "How would I get it from you?" She reached into her bag and produced a small notebook, the kind teachers and principals always seem to have. She wrote something on a page, tore it out with clean efficiency, and handed it across to him. Her name, her number, and underneath, in neat handwriting, "Call before Saturday so we can arrange the handoff. Or we could have coffee. Either works." Martin looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. She was back to reading her book, or appearing to read her book, with the same composed, unhurried expression she'd worn in October. But the angle of her body was facing him completely now, openly, without pretense, and the very corner of her mouth held something that was not quite a smile but was unmistakably the next best thing. Martin folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "Coffee," he said quietly. "Definitely coffee." He called on Wednesday. They met the following Saturday, not at Eddie's barber shop, but at a small cafe 3 blocks down Clover Avenue that had been there almost as long as the barber shop and smelled of cinnamon and old wood. Gloria arrived 2 minutes before him, already seated, already with coffee, already reading, and she looked up the moment he walked in, before he had even spotted her, as if some part of her had been oriented toward the door since she arrived. He sat across from her, and she closed her book, and they talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes without either of them noticing time passing, which is the oldest and most reliable sign of all. They talked about the bridges he had built and the students she had shaped, about grandchildren, her 2 in Atlanta, his 1 in Portland, about the specific, particular loneliness of houses that used to be louder, about Isabel Wilkerson and the weight of history and the strange mercy of books that tell you the truth about the world without looking away, about how retirement had felt, at first, like losing a language, and how you had to find a new one. At one point, somewhere in the second hour, Martin said, "My daughter told me you showed me 3 signs in October, that I almost missed all of them." Gloria looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, warm, direct, slightly amused. "What signs?" The repeated looks, the angle of your body, the response that went one step further than the question asked. She considered this. "Your daughter sounds perceptive. She's a therapist." "Ah," Gloria smiled, the full one. "Then she was right, though I wasn't entirely conscious of all of it." "The body doesn't lie," Martin said, quoting Renee without attribution. "No," Gloria agreed, "it doesn't." She looked at him steadily, without looking away. "It also wasn't only 3 signs, for what it's worth. There were more. You just only caught 3. Martin laughed, a real surprised laugh that he hadn't expected. "How many did I miss?" he asked. "Enough," she said, "that you have some catching up to do." On the drive home, Martin thought about the paper she had handed him in Eddie's waiting room. "Call before Saturday, or we could have coffee. Either works." He had built 40 years of structures that would stand after he was gone. He understood load-bearing walls and tension and the precise distribution of weight across a span. He understood that the most important part of any bridge was not the span itself, but the foundations on either side, the ground you trusted to hold. Sitting across from Gloria Tate for 2 hours and 40 minutes, he had felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground beneath him was solid. Not certain, not guaranteed, but solid in the way that mattered, the way that made you willing to build. He pulled into his driveway, sat for a moment in the quiet car, and thought of the 3 signs his daughter had named. Repeated attention, the body's honest direction, the response that reaches slightly further than required. He thought of all the years he had been too settled to look for them, too convinced of his own invisibility to see what was visible. Then he took out his phone and sent Gloria a text that said, "I had a wonderful morning. Same time next Saturday?" Her reply came in 40 seconds. "I'll bring the Wilkerson." Martin Elroy, 67 years old, retired civil engineer, builder of structures meant to last, smiled at his phone in the driveway of his quiet house on a November afternoon, and began, carefully and with full intention, to build something new.